Okay, so for all intents and purposes, I have completed the Kyosho RB6.6 build, and here we have it. I have to finish installing the electronics, the body, the wing, the wheels, all that stuff, but the chassis is done, and I'd like to, I have several notes actually on the build, and I want to talk about how this build compares to the RC10 B6 build. Which that guy's right here, okay, and I built this particular RB6.6 in the laydown configuration, which basically makes it the same type of gearbox configuration as the RC10 B6. So between the two of them, I mean, you can go and watch my B6 build series, my B6 build review, and everything I had to say about that, the good and the bad. I did several builds on Kyosho kits, a couple of lasers, an RT6, and this build was pretty similar in terms of how the instructions went and how the build went and the parts quality and everything. There's really not a whole lot that's different here between this updated RB6 and the previous generation RB6.0, which I do have one that I've been running recently, and it basically, you know, it's the same as this with a few exceptions. So going back to how the RB6.6 and the RC10 B6 compare in terms of the build, I would describe them as thematically consistent. So with the RC10 B6, everything is kind of fast and cheap. If you know what you're doing, you can slap together the whole chassis in a couple of hours. You know, the process is relatively simple, with the exception of the fact that the instruction manual is actually not very good in the B6. But in prior team-associated builds, like the B5, the B5 mid-motor, the ST5M, it's kind of fast and cheap. And that's not to say that it's bad, it's just fast and cheap. With the Kyosho kits, they're much slower builds because you have to really take your time, you know, measuring out the screws that you're using to make sure you're using the right screws for each part of the build. A lot of parts come on parts trees, and so you have to cut them out and get all the flashing off of the parts. But the quality of the parts definitely appears to be better on the Kyosho kits, and I believe I've said this multiple times. When I was building the B6, when you screw certain things together, if I remember correctly, like when you screw the rear shock tower onto the rear gearbox, and when you screw the bottom of the shock into the suspension arms, the plastic tends to squeak as you're tightening the screw in. And I don't know if that necessarily means the plastic is a cheaper plastic, but it's definitely a different compound or material of plastic than what you get in the Kyosho kits. Every time you put a screw into these parts, it just screws in nice and smooth. There's no squeaking, there's no noise. It's just nice and quiet. The screw goes in. So they definitely use a different plastic here than what you get with the B6. So I did want to point that out. The other sort of generic difference between them is the B6 is only a laydown configuration, right? It's only designed for that. If you want kind of a stand-up mid-motor configuration, you get the B6D. So the B6 kit is only one layout, and that basically means that it provides you with one setup for that one layout, okay? And, you know, that can be good or bad. With the RB6.6, you get 4 options. You can have a rear motor configuration, you could have a mid-motor configuration with 3 gears or 4 gears, or you can have a laydown configuration with 3 gears. I believe there's a 5th configuration where you could make a laydown with 4 gears, and if I remember to, I'll get to that in a moment. But basically that means you have at least 4 configurations you can build this car in, and that means that the instruction manual can get a little confusing at times, because on certain steps, like say when you put together the gearbox or when you mount the gearbox, you have to make sure that you're in the right configuration. Like this part here where you're mounting the rear tower, it says for 4-gear midship motor layout. So that's if you're running a 4-gear mid-motor layout, you go through this series of instructions. If that's not what you want to do, you have to flip through a little bit and find what you're looking for. This is 3-gear midship motor layout, and you keep going until you find what you need. Okay, not a big deal, but just make sure you pay attention as you're going through the build and you don't just blindly go through from one step to the next. The other sort of main difference is that Kyosho tends to go in the polar opposite direction when it comes to bags. On the Team Associated builds, they give you 3 gazillion bags, and that generates a whole lot of waste. Kyosho gives you, in this particular kit, I think 8 bags, and they're very large bags, okay? And each bag, in the beginning of the build, has a whole bunch of stuff in it. So if a kit says, or if a particular step says that you need, say, bag 1 and bag 5, that means you have to fish through these 2 very large bags to look for the parts that you need. And what ends up usually happening is you just take the screw bags from all of the bags and you just, throw them out onto a tray or something, and you just fish for what you need, and you measure them out, and you build the kit. By and large, I found that the Kyosho manual did not have any errors in it. The B6 build had a ton of errors where certain steps were actually wrong. That was not the case in the Kyosho manual. Everything went together exactly as it should. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, if I remember correctly. We have the rear bumper for this for this laydown layout. This rear bumper right here, and the rear shock tower for this laydown layout. Those exist in bag number 3. But when you get to that actual part of the step, let me see if I can find it. This is for the laydown. Right here, it tells you, and this step, use bag number 4, 6, and 8 for all the parts you need for this build. But this bumper here is not in either of these 3 bags. It does not exist there. It exists in bag number 3. So that's missing here. And likewise for the rear shock tower, which is here, it tells you bag number 6. Well, this is not in bag number 6. That's actually in bag number 3. Okay. Those are the only actual errors that I found in the manual. Everything else, the size of the screws you need, the size of the ball studs you need, everything else was accurate. And this is great. This is actually a marked improvement over what they had in prior generation kits. In particular, the Laser ZX5 had some errors in the manual. But all of the 6 series builds that I've done have actually been quite good in terms of the accuracy of the manual, so that's good. Another difference, this is a kind of an interesting difference between the RB6.6 and the RC10 B6, is if you look at the front, you'll notice the B6 front arms are gull wing. And on the RB6.6, the front arms are flat. Now, what a gull wing arm allows you to do is to run a lower ride height for the same total shock length. And there may be some suspension geometry alterations as well, but generically speaking, that's what a gull wing arm allows you to do, because you can run the shock, the end of the shock at the same position on the actual arm, and then when you make this part of the arm kick up, it basically, it moves the wheel axle up, which pushes the chassis down. You get a lower ride height for the same shock length. That's all it really does. But the Kyosho kit is such that you can, I assume, get similar ride heights as what you can with the B6 without having to go to a gull wing arm. So there's that to consider or to mention. Let's see, the front steering rack is all plastic on the RB6.6. They don't give you the aluminum rack, although I think with the RT6 you got it. I do not recall. But on the B6 you also get an all plastic steering rack, so those are kind of equivalent. That is a little surprising to me for both kits, because especially if you're going to run this in the layout configuration, and definitely obviously with the B6 all you get is a layout configuration, that's meant for high grip tracks like AstroTurf or carpet, and on those kinds of surfaces the cornering forces are much higher. You can end up with more distortion in the steering rack as you're trying to turn the car if you have a plastic steering rack. So if you're really crazy about it, you may want to get an aluminum steering rack if you're running on a high grip surface. But for most applications, you probably don't need to worry about that. Let's see. Yeah, this was kind of interesting. The when you're putting together the rear section of the chassis, okay, so you have this rear bulkhead, and they have you screw on a rear sway bar holder here, okay, but they don't give you a rear sway bar, or the ball ends that you need, to complete the rear sway bar part of the build. Now, in fairness, the B6 doesn't give you, a front or a rear sway bar either, for that matter, and they don't have you put on a rear sway bar cover as a result. Right? You worry about that later if you decide to get the rear sway bar for the B6. But for some strange reason, on the Kyosho build, they tell you to put this cover on, even though they're not giving you a sway bar that you would use that cover for. So that was a little peculiar. Let's see, I had a note on step 42. Yeah, going back to this step. This one step took me about 20 minutes to complete. And a big reason for that was because of this rear bumper, right? It was in bag number 3, and the instructions were telling me in bags 4, 6, or 8 I had all the parts I needed. So I was spending all my time looking through these 3 bags, looking for this bumper, and it wasn't there. So I could have saved maybe 5 or 10 minutes just by knowing a priori that that bag was actually, or that part was actually in a different bag. This is kind of an interesting setup, though, how you have these 2 spacers here, one between the bumper and the rear inner hinge pin holder, and then another spacer between that and the rear bulkhead. And all of these things combined basically end up defining the final height of the rear bulkhead. So if you think about that for a minute, suppose I take this spacer here, which you do have an option for. You can run that at 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter height. And I think for this one also, you have an option for what thickness. It could be 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter thickness. Basically, by changing either of these 2 spacers, I can modulate the height of this rear bulkhead, which gives me a little bit more of a tuning option for my rear roll center. So imagine, for example, with the stock setup, you have a 1 millimeter spacer under the rear ball stud between that and the bulkhead. But say I wanted a higher roll center. So, okay, so I take that spacer out. Now the ball stud is as low as it can be on that bulkhead. And, okay, I run it, and it's fine. And maybe I realize I want an even higher roll center than that. Well, then I can play games with the spacers, with these 2 spacers, okay, to drop this bulkhead even further down, to drop that ball stud down. I don't know if that was really the intention of having these spacers in here, but I do think that's kind of interesting if you really think about what they could be used for. The only thing is, if you do decide to do that, you have to remember that the rear of this laydown gearbox mounts directly on top of this bulkhead. So if you drop this bulkhead down, there's going to be a gap between the bulkhead and the rear of the gearbox. So you may have to put some washers or something in there to fill up that space. Okay, let's see. The rear inner hinge pin holders have fixed toe-in and anti-squat. Okay, for the B6, to their credit, they do give you, not on the rear holder, but on the front rear holder, a series of inserts to allow you to adjust toe-in and anti-squat to your heart's delight. So you do have this extra tuning option on the B6 that you do not get on the RB6.6, at least with the parts that are included in the kit. You do get a few different hinge pin holder options, but it's not an insert system. You have to replace the entire hinge pin holder to change the toe-in or the anti-squat. Okay, I hope that's not going to be a big deal. I hope that just with the stock setting, it will run just fine for what I want to use it for. The other thing is, because you have 4 configurations that are possible here, and potentially 5. I'll get to that in a minute. Basically, Kyosho has to give you baseline setups for 4 different types of configurations, and that's not only for your roll center, but for your camber link lengths and your Ackerman and your bump steer and everything. And they give you a base setup to use depending on which layout you're using. If I had to guess, those setups are actually quite similar to each other. But and maybe those setups are not really optimal baselines for each of those different layouts. But the broader problem with that is the springs. So they give you in the kit, they have here, I think it's pink front springs and gold rear springs. So that's basically their softest front spring, if I remember correctly. It goes, yeah, softest front spring and like a medium rate rear spring. And that would be perfectly fine if you're running, say, a rear motor configuration on like a bumpy off-road track. Maybe for the 4-gear mid-motor configuration, that would be okay. But if you're running the laydown gearbox on a high grip surface, those springs are way too soft. And I've also found, on my RB6.0, I'm running a 4-gear mid-motor configuration. I had pink front springs, and those were way too soft. I had to go up to like maybe a gold spring, and that helped out a lot. So the springs they give you with the kit are probably, they're good for only certain configurations. So you will find that you have to buy a different set of springs based on what layout you're using. So again, I'm using the laydown layout, and I plan on running this on AstroTurf. So I'm trying to generally replicate the spring and oil setup that I'm using on my RZ6, which I'm also running on AstroTurf. So what did I do? I got yellow rear springs and orange front springs. So that's the second hardest spring on the rear and the hardest spring on the front. And then I run 32.5 weight rear oil, 40 weight front oil. And of course, as you're building the shocks, they don't tell you what oil to use. They never do that in any of their manuals. They just say to fill the shocks with oil. But they don't give you a baseline oil setup. And, least of all for this, where you have 4 different layout options, there's going to be a different optimal baseline oil setup depending on which layout you choose. So that's also a bit of a problem with this build. Let's see. Yeah, so the gearbox halves. With the laydown gearbox, it's, these parts are molded, and these two halves, they do fit together pretty well, but I did notice that when I pressed them together, there was a little bit of warpage going kind of out this way. So the halves, if you close the half on these two halves on the back, there's a bit of a gap on the front, and then you close that gap on the front, and a little gap opens up in the rear. It's not a big deal because once you tighten everything down, everything closes up nicely. But it would be nice if the molding were a little bit more accurate so that there was no warping or gap as you put those halves together. And while we're in this sort of gearbox subject here, you'll notice, maybe you can see it, there's this is where the diff goes in, and then you have this where the idler gear goes in, and then this here is where you put in the idler, this is the input shaft, sorry. This here is where you put in the idler shaft. And there's a few different holes here for the idler shaft. And what happens is if you're going to run the 3-gear setup, you run this middle hole here with a very large idler gear, this big fat monster right here. And if I would only presume that if you're running, let's see if I have it offhand, if you're running the a 4-gear laydown setup, you'd run 2 smaller idler gears with two idler shafts, and you put one on the bottom here and one on the top here, and that would be your 4-gear setup. I think the reason why they don't have a 4-gear laydown option explicitly in the instructions is because I'm pretty sure they only give you 1 idler shaft. If they gave you 2 idler shafts, then you could just, I would guess, put these in there and then run the 4-gear setup. Yeah, so theoretically, you could do actually 5 different layout configurations on this car. The actual gearbox itself is, I would say, more complicated than what you have on the B6. And I did a lot of complaining on the B6 build review about the rear gearbox and how many screws it takes to get to this gearbox. But it's actually about the same as it is with the RB6.6. Just to get to the diff, for both of the B6 and the RB6 is 18 screws. The only difference is with the B6, you have to go an additional 4 screws to take apart the gear diff to change the oil. With the RB6.6, they give you a ball diff. So if you ever need to get to the diff, it's only to, rebuild the diff to service it. And it's not, a ball diff is just one screw to take it apart. So technically it's fewer screws to service the diff, but to actually get to the diff, it is just as many screws between the RB6.6 and the B6. Let's see here. Okay, so let's go to rear tower, did that, 18 screws to diff, did that. Okay, and I talked about the setup, how it's not entirely clear whether the setup is optimal. The shock instructions. Shock instructions are okay. They're not bad or wrong. The only thing is they do not include telling you to use a little bit of oil on all of these O-rings here that are part of joints, like the shock collar that you use here to thread onto the shock body. You put an O-ring in there to help hold it down. In the associated manual, I think they tell you to, put a little oil on the surface of this O-ring to help thread the shock collar in. It actually helps quite a lot when you do that. And also, on the shock cap, if you put a little oil on that O-ring, it helps to tighten down the shock cap and make a better seal. And for the bottom shock cap, you have 2 O-rings here on either side. Again, put some oil on those. It'll help the cap tighten down without distorting the O-ring. It'll hold its circular shape rather than, kind of distort, and you get this little O-ring lump coming out of the assembly. Put a little oil on there, it all goes together a lot easier. And also, when you thread or when you push the shock shaft through the seal assembly, make sure to use some green slime or at least some shock oil or something to help make sure you don't tear up the O-rings. One thing I was thinking about is, why exactly are the Kyosho shocks so much better than the team associated shocks in terms of their, not only their smoothness, but for how long they can remain smooth compared to the associated shocks. You run an AE shock and it'll be good for a while, but after, maybe a week or two, it doesn't feel so great. And it gets really dirty really fast, and the actual internal, shock guides start to wear out. The Kyosho kit, you don't notice that. You can run it for months and months and the shock still feels fine. One reason why that's the case with the Kyosho shock is I'm pretty sure that these guides here are machined. You get them in a bag, and they're not on a parts tree. So I don't think they're molded. I think they're machined parts, so they have better tolerances as a result. The other thing is this center guide here is long, and it's longer than the center guide in the associated shocks. And as a result of that, there's probably a lot less lateral distortion or play if you try to wiggle the shock shaft around. So it's a much better seal assembly, and it's a lot smoother as a result. The material they use for this also appears to be a denser plastic as opposed to the associated parts, which are quite a lot lighter. And so, that also means they're going to wear out more easily. The Kyosho parts don't really do that. Let's see. I think I've covered everything here. So now the big question is, which one do I prefer, at least in terms of the build, right? I did have a lot of nasty things to say about the B6 build when I did that build review, but in fairness, the Kyosho build wasn't perfect either. There were a few issues with it, but generally, the Kyosho build was better, I would say. It does take a lot longer to do the Kyosho build. You really got to take your time with it, and the way the build progresses, the way the manual puts you through the build, it doesn't allow you to rush the build. So in that sense, it's a good thing. Because you're forced to take your time and to make sure you get all your measurements right and make sure everything's put together correctly. But if you're in a rush, it's not so great. Some guys I know, they'll buy a B6 or a B5 or whatever, and they'll just slap it together, the night before a race, and it's ready to go. With the Kyosho kit, you'll find yourself having a fair amount of difficulty doing that. So at least in terms of the build, I personally prefer the Kyosho build. The parts feel better. It's not squeaky. It doesn't feel cheap. and the instruction manual isn't wrong. There's nothing really wrong in it. There are no errors, so to speak, with the exception of, you know, the one or two that I pointed out. The only thing that really goes against it in terms of the build is that they don't give you as much information for, you know, specifically what to set for your shock oil, and like what a good ride height setting would be. You know, I think if we go to, let me just recheck that real quick here. Yeah, when you screw on these shock collars, they don't tell you what, you know, spacing you should set between the collar and the shock cap. And they don't tell you, you know, elsewhere in the manual, what a baseline ride height should be. At least in the Team Associated manual, you get that. So, you know, there are some parts of the Kyosho manual that are missing information. And you could say that that means the manual has errors in it, if you treat missing information as an error. But even putting that aside, I do tend to prefer the RB6.6 build over the B6 build. As for how they drive, I'll have to find out. I know that the B6 is a very fast car, you know, on AstroTurf. I certainly plan on trying the RB6.6 as well. And we'll have to see. Chances are they're going to drive very similarly in the right hands. The starting setups are a little different, so I can, you know, I'll certainly end up spending time trying to optimize the setups for both. I don't know if I really want to invest the time in running both of them, so that is a bit of a problem. You know, I may end up focusing on, say, on the Kyosho more, because I'm running more Kyosho stuff now anyway. So I guess that's kind of my general assessment here. Kyosho is a little bit more expensive to start with, but if you think about getting a B6, you have to remember you're probably going to get more replacement parts. You'll be building the rebuilding the shocks more often. You're going to get the sway bar kit. You're going to get probably a whole bunch of J Concepts bling, because that's what people do when they buy Team Associated stuff. So you may end up spending just as much or more on a B6 as you would with the Kyosho over time. So for that reason, I would tend to prefer the Kyosho kits anyway, because it's less maintenance, it's less hassle. It's just more work up front to do the actual build. So I hope I didn't leave anything out here. But, you know, we'll see over time how these two are. And I guess that's it. So thanks for watching.